Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. One takeaway from the COVID pandemic has been how significant broadband access has been for a myriad of activities, whether it's telework, telemedicine, e-commerce, and the like. But no area is probably where it's been more important, particularly for those of us who are parents, is when it comes to education and the ability of students to access the internet, either by having internet connection via broadband or with devices. It's been a very big issue, and the government's trying to address that at various levels, federal, state, and local. Our guest is Joe Hayes, who's with the PPIC, who's co-authored a report entitled Achieving Digital Equity for California Students. And so we're very delighted to have him with us today. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So Joe, I want to ask you, a lot of federal and state dollars have been thrown at this problem, made more serious by the pandemic. The federal government has had initiatives to expand broadband access in the tune of about $40 billion over the years. Since 2020, California, the state, has allocated about $6 billion. And that's not even including what all local school districts are doing in this area. The question I guess a lot of people have in their minds is, are we seeing corresponding improvements in student success?
Sure. Well, to be clear about this report, written with my colleague Neil Gall, we focused on the period from spring 2020, at the outset of the pandemic, to spring 2021, a year later. So the changes that we document would have come from efforts of local school districts, municipalities, counties, and also benefited from the federal dollars you mentioned. The state money that you referred to, the $6 billion allocated as part of SB 156, that passed in July of 2021. So those effects are not going to show up in the report that we did. But I'm happy to talk about what we were able to measure. What we found was somewhat encouraging. We did see increases in internet access across all demographic groups, and in fact, greater increases among groups that have historically had less access. So in this case, Black and Latino households, low-income households, and households headed by somebody without a college degree. So just to give a couple numbers here, in the spring of 2020, 71% of all California households with school children had reliable internet access. And then by the next year, that had increased to 75%. Breaking that down a little bit, among households headed by somebody with less than a college degree, the rate increased from 67 to 72%. So it's a big increase, but that just puts them on par with the state average. Among low-income households, going up from 57 to 66%, a big jump, but still now well below the state average.
Right.
More privileged.
But it's trending in the right direction. I mean, it's improving.
For sure, and so the thing that's encouraging about that is that those percentage point increases that I mentioned are bigger than the ones you saw in the more privileged groups, the white, Asian, high-income, college-educated households. Those all saw smaller percentage gains, but then end up maintaining much higher rates of internet access.
Yeah, because they already have internet access, in large part. Let me ask you about devices, though. I mean, you have access to the internet, but if you don't have a device, it doesn't matter. So what about devices?
Right. So since the spring of 2020, the state had established a number of partnerships with internet service providers, technology companies to deliver devices, including Wi-Fi hotspots. And in addition, 95% of districts reported having purchased new devices for their students. And so these efforts did pay off. They appear to be more dramatically successful than the internet connection activities. In aggregate, in spring of 2020, we had 68% of California households with children reporting reliable device access. And then by a year later, this had shot up to 82%. Again, our report breaks down how that households with school children among the different groups compared with that. And again, the takeaway is mainly that more disadvantaged groups had higher percentage point increases, but that the end result is still a glaring digital equity gap. Each of the counterpart groups, the more privileged groups, had access rates of close to 90% at the end of that.
That's, it's actually not surprising. Though, like I said, the gap seems to be closing a little bit. I want to ask you, we've got about a minute left in the segment. I want to ask you about, so who can fully participate when it comes to distance learning? So we're talking about not just broadband access, but also, having a device to access the internet.
Right. So to take full advantage of it, you need to have lab access to high-speed internet and a device. So we looked at the intersection of those groups as well, what we're calling full digital access. So in the aggregate, the households we're looking at with school children improved from 61% having both of those things to 71% having both of those by the spring of 2021. That's good news, but it also means that nearly 3 in 10 such households lacked either internet access or a device. And again, the breakdown takeaway is that bigger substantial gains among more disadvantaged groups traditionally, but really not quite catching up among the marginalized groups compared to the more privileged groups.
Okay, well, when we come back, undoubtedly we're seeing some improvements. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the major gaps to fulfill that digital divide, close that digital divide rather. So what's it going to take? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. As noted by our guest, quote, the COVID pandemic has shown digital connectivity is critical to student learning. For those of us who are parents, we say, yeah, no kidding. We're talking with Joe Hayes. He's with the Public Policy Institute of California, and he recently co-authored an article entitled Achieving Digital Equity for California Students. I'm just wondering, Joe, what is stopping us from achieving universal broadband access?
Lack of infrastructure and affordability are the key constraints at the moment. Not surprisingly, for instance, rural areas suffer from a lack of infrastructure. ISPs are often reluctant to spend the money to build connectivity in areas when the number of subscribers is unlikely to provide a return on that investment. But our mapping also shows that there's gaps in connectivity in urban areas, and not surprisingly, these track pretty closely with income. Even if the service is available, it's often out of the price range of many households.
Yeah, and so you see situations like in rural areas, poor rural communities in particular, they must be really hit by this. They're the ones who are having the biggest problem, I would assume. Let me ask you this. So the government's trying to step in here and trying to make sure that everybody has access to the internet. What is the government doing at the various levels, federal, state, local levels, to kind of close that digital equity gap?
Well, to address the infrastructure issue, the FCC has put $20 billion into the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and that the providers bid to deploy broadband to homes and small businesses in historically unserved areas. On the affordability side, in May 2021, the FCC launched the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, offered a broadband discount up to $50 a month. That expired at the end of 2021, but it was replaced by the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP, which offers support to eligible households, but at a reduced amount of $30 per month. On the school side, more than 400 California school districts have applied for ECF, or Emergency Connectivity Fund dollars since summer of 2021, and that's provided devices to over 1 million students and connected nearly 1 million students to broadband during the 2021-22 school year.
So you're seeing a lot of efforts to federal, state, local level to do this, and I know in your report you actually cited a few that are from the Valley, which I found really interesting. Fresno Unified was one. What's happening at Fresno Unified, and what can you tell our audience about the situation there?
Fresno Unified had identified earlier on the need for long-term off-campus internet access, particularly in the southern regions of the city. So the district managed to use its fiber optic backhaul, plus employing school buildings themselves as towers to deploy its own private LTE service. So that was successful in covering about 20 square miles of territory and more than 6,500 student connections.
Yeah, there was also another one you cited was a much different district, Lindsay, also in the Valley. What'd you find there?
Right, so Lindsay Unified over in Tulare County also perceived the need to provide service off campus and moreover outside of school hours for distance learning. And I should note that they started their project back in 2012, 2013. They built a community Wi-Fi network to deliver high-speed internet to students in their homes. It also relies on a private LTE network. And the district is currently supplementing that coverage with Citizens broadband radio service in order to cover more densely populated areas. An example of what they call redundancy, building redundancy into the system.
It sounds a little bit like these school districts are almost acting like the libraries of yore. I mean, you're connecting people to information. Is that a fair analysis or comparison?
There's a number of different models. We're actually doing a study right now, interviewing as many of the local initiatives as we can, and the models are pretty varied. But yeah, I mean that's a great analogy.
Yeah. And so let me ask you this. So we got about a minute left, in this segment. I want to ask you about what state and local and even private agencies are doing to kind of reduce that digital equity gap among students. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do we begin to work on closing that gap?
Well, so getting back to the two major constraints, infrastructure and affordability, one thing we've identified is better data and mapping is going to be crucial to identifying existing gaps in coverage. And
Wouldn't ISPs already have that mapping or no?
they do. In fact, the FCC maps that almost everybody's using are informed by information that the ISPs are required to submit. The problem with that is that ISPs have an incentive to shall we say, overstate the coverage that they're providing. And so a lot of times it's impossible for other smaller providers to get in there if an area it looks like it's covered currently by an ISP. So an executive order at the state level and the Broadband Data Act of 2020 at the federal level both mandate improvements to data collection and mapping tools that inform internet access. And I think that's going to be crucial for the process.
Yeah, that's going to be very important. And I should say that ISP stands for Internet Service Provider. And I know that sounds relatively simple to an expert like you, Joe, but for someone like me, that's something I have to actually think about. I want to thank our guest, Joe Hayes with the PPIC for being with us. Up next, we're going to talk about what California could specifically do as a state to address this problem. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. In 2021, the governor and the legislature reached a three-year, multi-billion-dollar broadband infrastructure agreement. What exactly is in that spending plan? Our guest is Brian Metzker. He's an expert in technology and broadband issues with the non-partisan legislative analyst office. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me.
So Brian, what's in this new spending plan, this 2021 multi-year broadband infrastructure agreement?
Sure. So as part of the 2021-22 spending plan, the administration and the legislature agreed to spend $6 billion over 3 fiscal years on broadband infrastructure. Of the $6 billion, about $4.3 billion is federal funding from the American Rescue Plan signed into law in March of 2021. And the remaining $1.7 billion of available funding is from the state's general fund.
That's a lot of money. So I'm just wondering what kind of projects and programs are going to be funded by that spending plan? A lot of money.
Yeah, a lot of money. About 3 categories of broadband projects or programs in the agreement. The first project is what's called a statewide open access middle mile network. It's a network of fiber optic cables available across the state for internet service providers to provide communities and households with broadband access. The state appropriated about $3.25 billion in federal funding for this network in 2021-22. Second set of projects are last mile projects. That's projects that connect the middle mile network to communities and to households. The state appropriated about $2 billion for those projects, which is about $1.1 billion federal funding and the rest state funding. And that's provided to the California Public Utilities Commission, or the CPUC, who's going to distribute those last mile project grants through its California Advanced Services Fund program. And the last part of it was for the Broadband Loan Loss Reserve Fund. That's a fund that's also administered by the CPUC, and it helps local entities and nonprofit organizations to obtain better financing terms and potentially get larger loan amounts for local projects. And that's about $750 million general fund.
Yeah, a lot of people think, a lot of people think, the PUC, they don't think of it about broadband, they think about utilities, but they have a big role to play here. I want to ask you, is more money going to the more populous urban counties, or is it going to the more sparsely populated rural counties?
Well, specific to last mile projects, the state law SB 156 specifies that the CPUC has to split the allocation of funding equally between rural and urban counties until at least June 30th of next year. So you get about $1 billion for rural counties and $1 billion for urban counties. Each of those counties will receive an initial allocation of $5 million, and the rest is based on how many households within that specific group don't have access to broadband internet service of a certain speed. And so, the CPUC just released its, final decision on this a few months ago. And in effect, it provides a little bit more funding per household in rural counties, just because there are fewer of those,
Right.
and they cost more to build.
Right. Yeah, you'd expect that. You did talk about broadband infrastructure, and for those of us that aren't that technically literate, you went over some things about long haul, middle mile, and last mile. And I'm wondering if you can kind of briefly explain those concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. Long haul broadband infrastructure is often comprised of, high capacity cables that span hundreds or thousands of miles and typically connects countries or connects, very large regions. Middle mile infrastructure is a little bit shorter. It's tens, if not hundreds of miles at a time, and it provides more of a local internet backbone like for a state. And then your last mile infrastructure are all of the cables, the poles, the wires that connect that middle mile network to your home or your local library or some local institution.
Yeah, and that last mile, I'm guessing, is also pretty expensive. It's just the last mile, but it can be pretty expensive to deal with that. There's also something that you talk about in your report, a California Advanced Services Fund. I'm just wondering, what is it? How is it funded? How will it improve the state's broadband infrastructure?
Sure. So the CASIF, with the exception of that new fund that was created with the $2 billion, it primarily uses a surcharge on revenues that is collected by telecommunications companies to fund broadband grants. And so, for example, the broadband adoption account within the CASIF, it awards grants to increase after-school access to the internet, particularly in low-income communities and other communities that have a demonstrated need. So those accounts that are within the CASIF program, they work in tandem with the recent agreement on broadband infrastructure.
So there's a lot of money flowing to this issue for sure. Well, up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the California legislature is doing to close the digital equity gap that exists. This is Mark Keppler with the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Brian Metzker. He's an expert in technology and broadband issues with the non-partisan Legislative Analyst Office about recent state action to improve the state's broadband capacity. And as we know, through the pandemic, how important having internet access it really is. So I want to ask you, Brian, when you're discussing broadband infrastructure, you refer to unserved communities and underserved communities. Can you explain the difference?
Sure. So unserved households are those that don't have an internet access at the federal benchmark speed for broadband. That's set by the Federal Communications Commission, and it's approximately 25 megabits per second download speed and 3 megabits per second upload speed. So to give a perspective, that's going to allow several devices within a household to download files, telecommute, attend school remotely, those sorts of things. An underserved household is a household that doesn't have access to internet service, but at a higher threshold speed, typically 100 megabits per second download speed, and in some cases, up to 20 megabits per second upload speed. Those higher speeds are intended to, in essence, future-proof broadband infrastructure projects.
Yeah, anybody knows if they have multiple family members all trying to get on the internet at once, you can have issues, and then that really can be problematic because mom or dad are working, they're telecommuting, the student, the daughter or son is trying to do their homework. It can create you do this first, you stay off, and everybody's got to get in line, as it were. Sure. When I look at your report, you're talking about California counties with the highest percentage of unserved and underserved households are basically in the rural areas of the state. So I'm wondering, does that mean this really isn't a problem for the state, statewide? This is kind of an isolated problem?
Well, based on our review of the CPUC data for unserved and underserved households, we can see the lack of broadband access is a problem statewide. So as you mentioned, rural counties do appear to have a higher percentage of unserved and underserved households. For example, in Siskiyou County, about 24% of households were unserved and about 85% of households were underserved as of December 31st of 2020. But there are approximately only about 20,000 households total in Siskiyou County. When you look at a larger urban county like Los Angeles County, you have 3.4 million households total. And so a lower percentage still equates to a higher number of unserved and underserved households. So taking that same data set, you have 47,000 households that are unserved, even though that's only 1% of the total, and 54,000 households are underserved. So
Yes.
yeah. Oh,
I'm sorry. Yeah, numbers can be a little bit misleading when you look at those percentages. For example, looking at your report saying underserved households, 74% in Alpine County. The state average is 3%. So that sounds terrible, but Alpine County is pretty small. So sure. Yeah, the percentages can be a little deceiving, though it's still obviously a big problem for those rural communities. I want to ask you, you hear a lot about the need and challenge of addressing that last mile. We talked about that a little earlier. What's the legislature doing to address that last mile of broadband projects?
Sure. So the legislature passed several bills to help expedite some of those last mile broadband projects. Of course, Senate Bill 156, which is the implementing legislation for the broadband agreement, was a critical piece of legislation just to define the allocations of broadband funding and define those benchmark speeds we just talked about. Other legislation, such as Senate Bill 4 from Senator Gonzalez, directed the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development to streamline permitting and approval processes. Other bills, for example, Assembly Bill 41 from Assemblymember Wood requires Caltrans to put conduit cable availability into certain existing construction projects. So there are other bills pending, but these pieces of legislation are intended at least to move projects along.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are always worried about, is the state kind of getting in the way with regulations? Here are some examples of, we're trying to be efficient. We're redoing a road, make sure you lay the cable at the same time, or
Exactly.
be efficient in terms of getting some of these approval processes, getting some of the red tape out of the way so we can get these projects done. So they are addressing some of those issues that people have been concerned about for years, frankly. Let me ask you this, one last question. What are some of the issues you think the legislature should be considering when we talk about this last mile and broadband infrastructure projects?
Well, a big issue is how to program new funding that's going to be coming in for last mile broadband infrastructure projects from the federal infrastructure bill that was signed into law November of last year. It includes about $65 billion in new funding for broadband infrastructure, of which about 2/3 is grants to the states and other territories. And so the state will receive a minimum of $100 million, but likely is going to receive hundreds of millions of dollars more over the next several years. So we want to make sure that's programmed alongside what we're already doing in an effective and cost-efficient way. Another issue is how to evaluate the grants that are actually made to make sure that those folks that are supposed to be served actually subscribe and are served with the new broadband available. And lastly, just to make sure the legislature has oversight of this agreement and is looking at everything from these last mile projects to the middle mile network. And that active participation and oversight is important to make sure the goals of the agreement are achieved.
Yeah, it's as per usual. The legislative analyst has come up with some really good recommendations that hopefully the legislature is going to take a close look at. I want to thank our guest, Brian Metzker from the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.